lesson 2 on microeconomics, we have already discussed what market demand is. This is the total individual demand for a particular product or service. This looks at individual markets. In contrast, aggregate demand looks at demand for the whole economy, so the total spending by consumers, businesses, governments, and also our net exports. So aggregate demand is represented by the formula AD is equal to consumer spending plus investments plus government spending plus net exports, which are exports minus imports. The aggregate demand curve remains downward sloping, but we have different labels for the axes. The x-axis shows the real national output or real GDP, and the general price level is represented by the y-axis. The aggregate demand curve shows us the total spending on domestic goods and services in an economy. Now imagine we start at point A and there is an increase in the general price level to point P2. As a result, we have a movement along the AD curve and there is a contraction in aggregate demand. In other words, there is a fall in real GDP or real national output. If we were to move from point B to point A, there would be an expansion in aggregate demand and an increase in real national output and real GDP. Let's take a look at why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. The first reason is called the balance of trade effect. So imagine if the price of domestic goods increased. This would make foreign goods more attractive to purchase, causing a fall in exports and a rise in imports, and as a result, aggregate demand would fall. This is shown on the previous graph. We can see that once we move from point A to B, due to the price increase, national income actually falls. Next, we have the income effect. When the price level increases and we have inflation in the economy, the real value of income falls. This is because the prices of goods and services have increased and people can now purchase less with their income. As consumption falls, we can see in the formula that this results in a fall in aggregate demand. This is represented in the previous diagram from the movement of point A to B. And finally, we have the interest rate effect. If interest rates were falling, maybe the government are trying to stimulate consumer spending through an expansionary monetary policy to reach their 2% target, this would encourage more spending and less saving. As the reward for saving has now fallen and it's also cheaper to borrow money. Anything which affects the factors of consumption, investments, government spending or net exports will cause a shift in the aggregate demand curve. A change in real incomes will cause AD to shift. If there was a fall in business confidence, this would also cause the number of investments to fall and aggregate demand would decrease, causing a shift of the curve to the left. Government spending increased, this would cause aggregate demand to shift to the right. And finally, if there was a change in the exchange rate, which weakened the pound, this would make imports more expensive and exports cheaper. So we would see the aggregate demand curve shift to the right. This is shown in the graph in the next slide. Demand-side shocks are unexpected events which could either increase or decrease aggregate demand. A positive shock would increase AD and a negative shock would decrease AD. So a fall in interest rates would actually stimulate consumption and therefore increase demand. A fall in taxes would do the same, as people would have more disposable income to spend and consumption would increase. And for negative demand side shocks, we have the main one being the COVID-19 pandemic, which has reduced consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports significantly.